Welcome today to today's coffee seminar. We have Professor Roger Pielke Jr. from Center of Science and Technology Policy Research, the University of Colorado. Professor Pielke Jr. has been on the faculty of the university since 2001, the Environmental Studies Program, and is the fellow of the CIRES, the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences. Before he was a scientist at NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research. At CIRES, he served as the director of the Center for Science and Technology Policy Research from 2001 to 2007. His research focuses on the intersection of science and technology and decision making. He's the author, co-author, or co-editor of 7 books, including The Honest Broker, Making Sense of Science in Policy and Politics. And his last one, Climate Fix, What Scientists and Politicians Won't Tell You About Global Warming.
All right.
So, welcome.
Thank you. I was going to say what a great turnout, then I saw this sign-up sheet here with people signing their names. But it's great that you're here, and hopefully we can have a conversation, and it's not just going to be me lecturing. That's okay too, but if you have questions, comments, I'll try to provoke you a little bit. So I study science policy, which involves decisions about science and technology and decisions with science and technology. And I'll tell you how I got into this field. I told a few of the students an abbreviated version of this in the last hour. I went to school here at the University of Colorado. In fact, 25 years ago, I was walking around this building. I started out in aerospace engineering. My father's a scientist. He's a pretty prominent scientist, and I thought for a long time, you know, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I'd be a scientist too. I got a math degree as an undergraduate, and I decided, you know, I'm going to get a leg up on my peers, and I'm going to learn something about public policy on my way to a PhD in science. While I was doing that, my advisor, a guy named Rad Byerly, who directed a Center for Space and Geosciences policy here at CU, he got asked to be the chief of staff for Congressman George Brown, who's the chairman of the Science Committee. Before I went with him to Washington for a brief stint, I paid part of my way through college being a Fortran programmer at NCAR. Here in Boulder when I was an undergrad. One of the things that you don't realize when you're the son of a prominent scientist is that you think everyone grows up learning how to become a Fortran programmer. Apparently that's not true, so I had a skill. And so I got to work with all these famous scientists up at NCAR, and this is when they were talking about the ozone hole. And I got to hear them saying things like, if only those politicians better understood science, the world would be a much better place. I thought, oh, that's probably true. So then when Rad Byerly took me to Washington, I got to sit around with the staff. I was like a glorified intern, but I got to sit with the senior staff. Saw Nobel Prize winners come in, try to explain how important science was, people whose names you would recognize. They would leave the office, and the staff, many of whom had PhDs in some science area or another, you know, they'd make fun of them. Oh, scientists coming through, they don't understand how politics works. And they said, if only these scientists would understand how Washington works, the world would be a much better place. And it was at that point I realized there's this huge disconnect between how scientists think about the world of policy and how policymakers think about scientists. And so I never wound up going back to get my PhD in science. I finished up a PhD in political science, focused on science policy. And I've been working on basically issues of science policy in a number of different contexts ever since. And so what I'm going to talk today about is some of the analysis in my book, The Honest Broker, and I'll leaven it with some stories from our Science Advisor series. 2005, 2006, and at the beginning of 2007, we had 7 former presidential science advisors come through Boulder. They gave a public lecture, and I interviewed them on stage. And they did a book, basically of their memoirs of their time serving the presidents from Kennedy through George W. Bush. And that'll be the background for this. But what I want to talk about today is the roles that scientists might play in policy and politics. It's a recurring topic. It's particularly been the focus of attention really since 2004 In 2004, the scientific community organized to try to unseat George W. Bush. A group called Scientists and Engineers for Change was created. They put up billboards in Florida, and they tried to use science as an issue to unseat George W. Bush. I guess we all know how well that worked out. In 2008, the scientific community again tried to use science as a big picture political issue in support of President Obama, and they called for a science debate. Science debate 2008. Nice ring to it. The candidates, Democrats and Republicans, basically said, no thank you. And now, with the looming election next year, people are already talking about, well, what should scientists do? I was contacted about 3 weeks ago by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and they're doing a special roundtable on the question, what should scientists do when politicians make statements that are at odds with their scientific understandings? My piece is coming out on Thursday. The first one in the series came out last week. My piece starts out, here we go again. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this context. So you're a scientist, you're interested in participating in the political system and policy, and you think you have some specialized expertise that might be relevant to decision makers. What do you do? What are your options? And so that's the basis for this talk. Let me start with, there's an image, and it's cultivated particularly in the blogosphere, but also I think we reinforce it in academia, that there's this linear path that you get knowledge right, you get the facts correct, you get the science right, and once you do that, the decision making is easy. And a topic that I work on a lot is climate change, and there's this view out there that if everyone just understood the science of climate change, then we would overcome this resistance to action. But of course, the reality is that there's a lot more going on in any set of decisions beyond just science. And it turns out that in a lot of cases, science is just a fig leaf. It's just how we're playing out our politics. People don't actually care about the science. They just find it convenient to invoke science, either for or against whatever they want to do. And we're not going to have Spock as president, which is one of the themes. All right, so here's a cartoon from the Peanuts. Charlie Brown hears from the statistician for their baseball team. Hitting and or fielding averages were down this year. So he says to the Peanuts gang, so you know what we have to do next season? And they say, we have to get a new statistician. All right, not improve their baseball. So this is the question. Should they get a new statistician? And the answer is going to be, it depends. It depends on what values you choose to maximize. Do you want information that will help you to win? In that case, you probably ought to get a new batting coach or a pitching coach. Or do you want information that makes you feel good? And who's to say what's the right outcome for the Peanuts gang, whether they want to feel good or whether they want information to help them win? Or do they want both? This isn't so far from reality that we face. All right, it's just a cartoon. The issue of mammograms has been almost constantly in the news for a period of several decades because people want to know, women in particular and their families want to know what kind of medical treatment should they have, what kind of screening should they have. And here's from the New York Times, when a study came out that said, well, no, actually, the age at which women should be getting mammograms should be closer to 50 rather than 40. And a lot of people said, well, no, I don't accept that. I don't care what the data says. And this is an oncologist in the New York Times. People don't like to hear this stuff about the debate. People cling to mammograms. They cling to the idea that there's something they can do to protect themselves. If you take away that as a security blanket, people turn to you and say, so what am I supposed to do? There's a lot of issues here with false positives, false negatives, but the idea that you're proactively doing something to protect your health, if you're a woman, is one of the reasons why women support mammogram screening. There's this idea that I don't care if the statistics say that there's going to be more unnecessary surgeries if we start mammograms at 40. I feel better about taking charge of my health with that screening program. And it's the exact same choice that the Peanuts gang faces, right? Is the purpose of mammogram screening to make people feel comfortable about their health? Or is the purpose to identify true correlates of risk related to breast cancer? And who should make that decision? Should it be the scientist, the medical doctor, who decides what's right for the woman? Or should the woman decide which values she wants to maximize? These cases come up over and over again. And the point here is that the science doesn't tell us what the right response is. We have grown comfortable in a lot of settings, and I'll go through a number of them, thinking about science as if it were some great moral compass. I have statements in all sorts of areas, from Yucca Mountain nuclear waste storage to the Plan B, so-called abortion pill, climate change. This is the chair of America's Climate Choices, the National Research Council, a scientific assessment. We really need to get started right away. This is responding to climate change. It's not opinion. It's what the science tells you, says the vice chairman. So does science actually tell us what we ought to be doing in a particular context? Do we have this disembodied voice of science that says, you shall take this action? Or is it actually the person speaking or this committee decided this is the course we ought to take, and we're supporting it in that context with some arguments that are grounded in theoretical and empirical knowledge? So here's the argument I'm going to give you today. Experts, and experts is a broad category. It includes scientists, but it's not limited to scientists. It might include people like intelligence analysts, for example, in the CIA. So experts have choices in how they engage policy and politics. And how those choices are made are important for societal decisions and their outcomes. So in particular contexts, how we make decisions about mammograms or climate change are important for public health and environmental outcomes. But I'm going to argue there's another layer here. They're also important for the governance of expertise. They're important for the enterprise that we call science and its role in society. And what I've observed, particularly in the past 10 years, it's been around forever, but I think it's been exacerbated for reasons I'll explain in the last decade. But there's a tendency for experts in all sorts of settings to engage increasingly in political advocacy. And I'll define what I mean by advocacy. And sometimes this engagement of experts in overt advocacy has harmed policy outcomes. And I'll give you some examples. And the argument is that some experts, and I'm going to say especially leading organizations like the National Academy of Sciences, AAAS, other professional organizations, and if I throw out acronyms that you don't know what they are, stop me and somebody be the acronym police. They ought to serve as honest brokers of policy alternatives. It's another term I'll define. It's the title of my book. But that's what I'm going to argue that we have a paucity of in our current debate. Issues at the interface of science and politics, I would argue, are enduring. When I interviewed science advisors, at least back to Eisenhower, these issues of conflict that arise between experts, politicians, the use of information, the muzzling of scientists, have been around for a long time. They gained particular prominence under George W. Bush, and really they have continued almost unabated under President Obama. There's a lot of issues in it. My argument is that it has a lot less to do with partisan Republican-Democrat issues than really mundane, maybe boring issues of bureaucracy versus political appointee, politicians who've decided on a course of action irrespective of what information says and selectively cherry pick the information that they want, and the fact that so many of our decisions now have a scientific or technological component to it, whereas they didn't used to. And so we see these things more. I think an important part of the context also is that many in the scientific community, certainly not all, and I wouldn't say a majority, but many have decided that science can be a powerful platform for engaging in partisan politics. A poll was taken of the membership of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the membership reported, of that membership, 6% self-identified as registered Republicans, 60% identified as registered Democrats. So it's no surprise the scientific community has decided to take sides in partisan debates. And the question would be, has this helped the political system to be more appreciative of science, or has this made the scientific community much more political in its outlook? Obviously, my views lean towards the latter. And just to tell you that there's a long history here. This is me interviewing Ed David in Old Main. Ed David was the science advisor for President Nixon. As I told a set of students before this talk, Richard Nixon was so upset at universities for hosting protests or allowing their students to protest the Vietnam War that he told his science advisor, Ed David, who his advisor was Jerome Wiesner, who was the president of MIT. He said, I want you to cut off all federal funding for research at MIT. And Ed David said, went back to his office and said, oh my gosh, what do I do? And another advisor, I don't know if it was one of the big Nixon advisors, came and said, don't worry about it, it'll blow over, he won't care about it. But Nixon did, he just got rid of the apparatus of the science advisor after that. They didn't cut funding for MIT, but he said, all right, I don't want a science advisor. Congress stepped back in and passed legislation to force the executive office of the president to have a science advisor. But these issues, every presidency has their issues, and they've steadily ratcheted up as science and technology become more and more important. All right, some basic definitions. These are terms just so you know what I mean when I say them. This is not to define them universally for all time. You could write a PhD on what these terms mean, but this is just so you know what I mean when I say them. Science is a systematic pursuit of knowledge. Policy is a synonym for a decision. It's just a commitment to a course of action. Politics is how we get done the business of society. It's bargaining, negotiation, and compromise in pursuit of a desired end. Anytime you get two people interacting, you're going to have politics. And it just so happens that politics is how we get done the business of a big, broad society where there's a lot of people with a lot of different interests. This phrase, politicization of science, which has gained some currency over the last decade, if you put these words together, the politicization of science, it doesn't sound so bad when you say it like this. The use of the systematic pursuit of knowledge as a means of bargaining, negotiating, compromising in pursuit of a desired end. And in fact, this gets to the core of the problem, because we want science to be politicized in the sense that we want science to be used in our political processes. Can you imagine taking a stance? We don't want science used in politics. No, we want to politicize science. What we want to avoid is what I call the pathological politicization of science. So it becomes more complicated. So we have this strange relationship with science and politics. We want science and politics to stay apart from each other, but we want science to be a part of our political decision making. So how do we do that? How do we meet those two criteria at the same time? How many of you have heard of the Preble's jumping mouse? Couple. I give versions of this talk really all over the world, and the only place anyone's ever heard of the Preble's jumping mouse is here in Colorado, which is always nice. The Preble's jumping mouse is a little critter that lives along the Front Range in Colorado and Wyoming. And long story short is that it's up for endangered species protection, but it depends upon whether the mouse actually exists. Not in an existential sense, but in a DNA sense. So there's a debate over whether its DNA is unique as compared with all the other mice that look just like that live on the Front Range. And if its DNA is not unique, then obviously it doesn't get protection under the law. Now, whether its DNA is unique or not is not something that you or I, well, where's Joanna? Maybe there's a few people in here. There's a few people in here who could be able to test, but most of us aren't able to judge that, right? We can't even look at the mouse. And in fact, if you look at the experts who are out there, guess what? They're divided. And there's like 12 people worldwide who have expertise in this type of mouse DNA. Some of them say it's unique and some of them say it's not. What do you do in that decision context? Well, here's what happens in the real world of politics. So the Wyoming delegation, which is mostly entirely Republicans who are concerned about economic development that's going to be halted because of the Endangered Species Act, they point to that set of scientists who publish peer-reviewed work that says it's not unique. So they put out a press release and say the Preble's mouse should never have been protected in the first place. There's a great deal of data that suggests that the mouse never even existed in Wyoming. This entire episode is the problems of junk science and how problems can affect private property owners in Wyoming. The estimates are it's like $200 million in impacts to private property owners in Wyoming. This is U.S. Representative Barbara Cuban from Wyoming. So Earth Justice, an environmental NGO, they say, well, no, we like these other studies. One point of controversy has been whether the Preble's jumping mouse is a distinct subspecies. the best available science, so they think it's junk science, they think it's the best available science, indicates that both prebbles and this is another mouse, the barrel-lodged mouse, have restricted ranges and are at risk of extinction. So what's the best predictor of what science you like? Your political orientation. In fact, on a whole suite of topics from stem cells to climate change to endangered species, I think any one of us can do a pretty good job of predicting people's views on scientists, including scientists themselves, based on their political orientation. And for a lot of people, particularly the general public who doesn't have a lot of scientific expertise, this amounts to the reduction of science to politics. That, why do we need the politics? All I need to know is your voter ID card, and I'll know what you think. So this is a general problem. This is from a nice book about think tanks, the rise particularly of conservative think tanks in Washington. At the beginning of the 21st century, research is evaluated more in terms of its ideological content and accessibility to audiences than by the quality of its content. So my concern with the politicization of science is that we are losing that which is special and unique and valuable about science, which it tells us something about the empirical world, because we are so quick in many contexts, and I say we, meaning us in the scientific community, to jump into political debates and self-segregate ourselves according to political orientations in a manner such that we lose the value of science. And once science gets replaced by politics, then we're in this kind of postmodern world where anything goes. And I don't think that ought to be the case. So why has this occurred? So I'm going to present some data on this, but this is the argument. This is where I'm going to lead you next. First is that science generally has been asked to be more relevant. This is really a post-Cold War trend. When I started graduate school in 1990, I started graduate school when the Berlin Wall was up, and at the end of my first semester, it was down. The world really changed. For a long time, there was this overriding idea that the Cold War basic research were just fundamental to the world that we lived in, and it was the East against the West. When the Berlin Wall came down, one of the questions that was asked was, why do we need all this research? Right? The Soviet Union broke up. They're not going to be going to Mars, or they don't have any missiles anymore. Why do we need research anymore? And we went from this one overriding justification for these enormous R&D budgets to, well, science helps us with health, the economy, the environment, and scientists should be relevant to all these decisions. So we've actually asked as a society science to actually step up and be more relevant. But for many scientists, when they hear relevance, they often translate into, we want you to participate in the political issues of the day. Advocate, go push for what you want, argue for science. But we know, this is an assertion, but I'm happy to talk in a lot of detail about it, but science is a poor tool for resolving political disputes. Just think about the Preble's jumping mouse. You might say, well, let's fund some research to decide whether the DNA is unique or not. Well, one of the things that people have documented related to science is that, at least in the short term, in a lot of cases, more research leads to more uncertainties. Why is that? Because you'll bring in people with different disciplinary backgrounds, different methodological approaches, and instead of having 12 experts with 2 opinions, if you fund a big research program, you have 100 experts with 23 different opinions on the topic. Maybe over the long term we reach closure, but there's a lot of topics that I can present to you where the science has gotten more cloudy. So how much carbon do forests and soils take up? Well, we were more certain about that 10 years ago than we are today because we're learning more and more. And so the net effect is that we're, instead of making politics more scientific, instead of working towards Spock running for president, we're seeing politics take greater hold within science. And I would argue this is exacerbated by what you see on the internet and the blogosphere, where there's every available opportunity for every single one of us to create what Cass Sunstein calls the daily me. Right? We can read on the internet all day long all sorts of information and never encounter a point of view that we find challenging or disruptive in any sense of way. But there's some good news. The good news is that as experts, we have choices in how we relate to decision makers in the broader society. So let me just quickly go through some examples. I would say this is more than just a US phenomena, but I will talk mainly about the US. So here's some example of demands for relevance. This is the head of the Millennium Project Task Force of the UN on Science and Technology. This is part of the Millennium Development Goals. And speaking to scientists, merely offering advice is not enough. I appeal to you, get your hands dirty. So as a scientist, be involved in decision making. This is from Africa, from the Ugandan National Academy of Science. Science and technology is not about only finding the vaccine, for example. It's also finding solutions for community survival and mechanisms for care and support. So I would suggest you at some point in not too distant history, science was only about finding the vaccine. So Wernher von Braun, he was the German scientist brought over to help NASA build their rocket program. He was famous for saying, you know, my job is to shoot the rockets up in the air. Where they come down, that's somebody else's problem. There's this idea in the past that scientists did basic research. And what happened with that research, you know, was obviously society's concern. This kind of blew up along with the atomic bomb when a lot of scientists decided, well, wait a second, what we're doing has such profound societal consequences that maybe we should be involved in its governance. And it's really morphed its way into all sectors of science. This is John Holdren, President Obama's science advisor. He says, science, technology, and innovation have been the primary drivers of economic growth and productivity growth for decades. And no matter how severe the fiscal constraint, this is not the time to stop investing in the drivers of economic growth for recovery, for job creation, for economic growth going forward. Why do we fund science and technology, according to him? It's not because it's cool, it's interesting, we learn about our work. It's because, you know, we have this unemployment, these economic problems. Science, that's the key. This perspective is probably most fully developed in Europe. So this is the European Commission. Expertise, and more specifically scientific expertise, is increasingly becoming an element of critical importance in the design, implementation, and assessment of public policies. As a result, policymakers must be in a position to consult the scientific community effectively and give scientists the opportunity to share their concerns and knowledge. So there's this idea that science, not only is it relevant to decision making, but it's intertwined with the very fabric of decision making. We need to build science in. Now, for a lot of the scientific community, they say, yeah, we like this idea of being relevant. We're going to need research funding if we're going to be relevant, of course. But there are times when the scientific community pushes back. So this is Alan Leshner, CEO of AAAS. He says, historically, science and technology have changed society. Society is now likely to want to change science and technology. So I'll explain what that means shortly, or at least to shape their course. For many scientists, any such overlay of values on the conduct of science is anathema to our core principles and our historic success. Now, this statement was made in the context of stem cell research. During the Bush administration, President Bush and his advisors decided they thought that stem cell research was morally offensive for a particular reason, and they wanted to limit federal funding for that. And what Alan Leshner is saying that society, there's some people in society who have values that are at odds with what the research scientists want to do, and scientists don't like that. They want to be able to do their research. They don't like this overlay of values. Today, this doesn't play out in the context of stem cell research because the Obama administration has kind of figured out how to work around that. But it is beginning to play out on the other side of the political spectrum with respect to geoengineering research. Geoengineering research refers to the idea that we could put particulates in the stratosphere or more clouds up to counter the effects of increasing carbon dioxide. And there's some in the environmental community who have said, well, no, maybe that's not such a good idea, particularly the biodiversity community. And they want to prohibit geoengineering experiments. It's very similar. The scientists say, well, we want to do the research. We don't want society to impose its values. Now, this is all the more ironic because the federal budget process every year is nothing if not an overlay of values on the scientific community. If you get federal research funds, it's because someone in society has decided that that's an important priority. That's an overlay of values. So it's an interesting perspective to take, as we don't want society telling us what to do, but we definitely want them funding us to do that which we do. But that's probably a smaller view. For many scientists, they've decided that yes, we accept this greater role in society. And I can tell you in the past 20 years, the students that I've taught have gone from having some significant portion of students who say, you know, I don't care what happens with my research. I just want to do my research because it's cool and it's interesting, to almost all the students I get today who say, I'm in science because I want to make a positive difference in the world. It's not just the science. I'm interested in the science, but there's also, I expect to be able to contribute. Some scientists, they do resist this call, but many others accept the challenge. But this then sets us up with a question. All right, so let's say that you accept this bargain with society. You will accept support for your research and demands to be relevant in exchange for the freedom to do your work, wonderful facilities, society that's willing to continue to give you money even in difficult financial times. So what roles might you play in that context, and with what consequences? And so the next part of the talk, I'm going to present to you a very simple, highly idealized framework that I think will allow us to have a conversation about different roles that you can play. And let me say from the outset, you don't have a choice. Whether you recognize it or not, you're going to take on one of the roles, maybe at different times, but one of the roles that I'm going to present, because you have to engage in some fashion. And to set this up, I'm going to give you two dimensions. One is how people think about science, and the other is about how people think about politics. And I'm going to use these two dimensions to come up with a very simplistic 2x2 matrix. And on science, I'm going to talk about the linear model view of science versus a stakeholder-driven model. And democracy, I'm going to talk about interest group pluralism versus elite conflict. And you can think about where your natural tendencies are, and that may help to explain where each of us as individuals find ourselves in this 2x2 grid. My argument is that a healthy, functioning scientific enterprise has people across entirely populating the space, but I'll get to that. Here's where I'm going to end up. There's four categories: the pure scientist, the issue advocate, the science arbiter, and the honest broker, according to these different criteria. This is very abstract and doesn't mean a damn thing right now, so I'm going to try to make it a little bit more concrete and return to it. All right, for a long time in society, we've operated really since World War II and Vannevar Bush's seminal report, Science and This Frontier, under this notion of a linear model. I'm just finishing up a research paper now on the evolution of the term basic research. The term basic research did not exist before 1920. It was not in our language. Today, it's almost impossible to have a discussion about science policy without someone bringing up the idea of basic research versus applied research. There's this idea that there's a pipeline, and we put money into one side of the pipeline, and we put it into basic research. And basic research takes place in places like this, in labs upstairs. And basic research provides the seed, the foundation for applied research. And applied research leads to development, technology application, commercialization, and out of the other end of the pipeline comes iPads and cell phones and medicines. And if you want to modulate the benefits, you just have to modulate how much money you put in the front end. So we'll see all sorts of arguments made that, this is John Holdren's, if you want economic progress, we need to keep funding science and technology. This is the linear model. I call it the BAD model, bad model, because it works in some small subset of cases, but not very many. The obvious example is often cited in the literature is, what owes more to astronomy? The basic science of how the planets move or the invention of the telescope? And obviously the technology came first. And there's other more complicated ways to critique this model. But this really has shaped how we think about science. And that's the big picture linear model. We have a little picture linear model, which is how science works in particular decision contexts. And this is from the website of the EPA. And it says, through research that is designed to reduce uncertainties, our understanding increases, and as a result, we change our assumptions about the impacts of environmental problems and how they should be addressed. There's this idea that in linear fashion, we focus on science, we focus on facts, and then we take policy action. I've seen dozens of versions of this wiring diagram where you have science goes into policy, goes into decision making in nice, straight, linear fashion. Now, in the past several decades, people who study science and society have critiqued this model, I would say, to death. In fact, when I sent in my book proposal for The Honest Broker, probably around 2005, it got reviewed, I'm pretty sure, by a physical scientist and by a social scientist. And the social scientist said, this chapter on the linear model, you have to take it out because this community has beat that to death. Everyone knows about the linear model. And the physical scientist wrote, this is the most interesting thing. I've never heard of anything like this before, which tells you something about the success of social scientists in getting their ideas out. So there's a very widely read book by Donald Stokes, a historian. He was from Princeton. He passed away about 10 years ago. But he coined this oxymoronic term, use-inspired basic research. But what he said was that we could be wanting to advance knowledge and use that knowledge at the same time. This linear model's on this diagonal here from basic to applied. This becomes problematic when the traditional definition of basic research is research conducted with no consideration for its use. So this is use-inspired research with no consideration for its use. But set aside that detail. There is a broader view that's been adopted beyond the linear model. And again, I'll point to the European Commission. It says, nowadays, true citizenship in the scientific domain should be built upon lively interactions between citizens and the scientific community. And this is what the governance approach by the Commission is striving towards. So look at the image. Science and society. It's no longer a linear model. They're deeply wrapped up together. And I see this all across campus, whether it's from the more medical sciences, the environmental sciences, the importance of stakeholders in research. The entire idea behind the NSF second review criterion, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, broader impacts, is this idea that it's not just scientific merit, but it's interacting with society that matters. As I said, this has been studied to death, and it has different jargony terms: collaborative assurance, mode 2 science, well-ordered science, use-inspired basic research, socially robust knowledge. I wrote a paper with Brad Byerly in '95 called For a New Social Contract. People don't like basic research anymore. You won't hear funders, and you don't see it appearing in Science and Nature as much, but we don't have a replacement for it. The point here is that we have two different schools of thought. We have this linear model view and this much more organic model of how science relates to the broader society. And they both coexist. Now, the other dimension is democracy. And the first view of democracy is this idea of interest group pluralism, which is the fundamental Madisonian democracy. And what he said is, here's how democracy works. We set up a system, call it the U.S. system of governance, U.S. government. Under that system, we can organize. We can get together with, here in Boulder, people that want to municipalize the utilities and people that don't, and we can fight it out. We can appeal to the public. We can put up our signs. And then we have an election, and then we settle the debate. And by definition, that is in the public interest because we've all had our say. Now, if there's problems with access or somebody has too much money, we can deal with that in the process. But interest group pluralism is that we settle our debates through organizing into interests. And the features of interest group pluralism are that common interests are achieved by the give and take of the political process. There's no point in asking what's in our shared interest. We have to go through the political exercise to discover what's in our common interest. Policy options come from the grassroots. We bring them to our peers. We appeal. They come from interest groups. And in this view, the role of experts is to help special interests, what Madison calls factions. And I have this term, which hopefully will make sense in a second, to reduce the scope of policy choice in their preferred direction. So when we have an election and we each have a stake in that election, we're trying to get the choices reduced, presumably, to the one that we want. So if you have two candidates, say you have Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, when we're having a debate over options, we're going to be trying to appeal to voters to only consider one, whichever one you happen to think is preferred. Now, there's a lot that's been written, obviously, about democracy, but what I want to point to is the excellent work of E.E. Schattschneider, who I think if he was named Smith, we'd all be talking about him, who wrote in the 1950s. He said, forget about this Madisonian view of democracy. That's not how things really work. He says democracy is a competitive political system in which competing leaders and organizations define the alternatives of public policy in such a way that the public can participate in the decision-making process. He says, don't kid yourself. Most people don't even care about politics. And he uses the example of going to an auto mechanic. And he says, when you go to a mechanic, you don't come up with options to fix your car. The mechanic says, I can do A, B, or C. How much do you want to spend? Here's what it will take to fix it. That we are assisted by experts in reaching judgments. And it's very much an elite model. And what he says is that common interests are identifiable independent of special interest demands on government. And policy options come from the experts. Forget this grassroots stuff. He says it's nonsense. And in this role of democracy, the role of experts is to expand or clarify the scope of choice, to open opportunities for political compromise. So the job of experts is to help the public clarify what their options are so they can participate in the democratic process. And I've set this up very much to be the opposite of the interest group approach. So here's how I put the pieces together. But what I'm going to do is illustrate this with an analogy, an extended analogy, which will take me to the end, to illustrate how these different roles occur in a real setting. And the setting is the question, where should we have dinner? So let's say I'm from out of town, and I show up in Boulder. I'm the decision maker. You're the expert. You're the local expert. You're the scientist in this model. And I'm going to role play this through the four different models, 4 different roles that the expert can play to answer this question. The pure scientist, all right? You may say, I don't want anything to do with your values-based decisions about where to eat. So I'm going to give you this big book, Dietary Guidelines for Americans. And you can use that and decide where to eat. Now, there's a few practical issues there. One is that, it doesn't really tell me where any restaurants are or how much they cost or things that might be practically relevant. But there's a deeper problem here, is that anytime you bring science to a decision maker, there's some consideration being made as to what is relevant and what's not relevant. And this is this linear model, right? Let's decide what a healthy diet is, give it to the decision maker, they can decide then what to eat. The problem is, social scientists study all sorts of things, including dietary guidelines. This is Gene Goldberg. The USDA, it turns out, is responsible for coming up with nutrition guidelines and protecting the commodity groups. So the USDA is the lead agency in nutrition education. How can that be if it's also the organization responsible for protecting the commodity groups? I think it's tough. And Marianne Nessel says, creating the food pyramid guidelines is still political from start to finish. It's science politics, it's politics, it's corporate politics. If you go on the web and you Google food pyramid, you can come up with a vegetarian food pyramid, a vegan food pyramid, an Atkins food pyramid, the US government's food pyramid. Which one of those is right? Should beef be part of the dietary guidelines? Well, the USDA thinks that beef is pretty important because there's a lot of ranchers in the United States. But what if you're a vegetarian? Can science resolve what a healthy diet is? So the argument I would make is that, yes, there's such a thing as pure science. And if Bill Gates gives you $1 billion and you go to an island and you sever your connection to the outside world and just follow your curiosity on research, then maybe you're doing pure science. Otherwise, it's not part of this conversation here. The minute you want to connect your science to decision making, you're outside of pure science. So another role, a really important role, is what I call the science arbiter. And this is equivalent to the concierge at a hotel. So I could come to you and I could say, can you tell me the location of 3 conveniently located Thai restaurants? Or can you tell me an Italian restaurant that costs less than $20 per plate? Or where are fast food restaurants? The point here is that I am asking you, the expert, to render a judgment on a question that can be resolved empirically. Right? This is what science does in fantastic fashion. If I say to you, how much arsenic is in the water? This is a question that science can answer with great precision. Now, if I ask you how much arsenic should be in the water, that's a different sort of question. Or, do you think I'd prefer Thai food tonight? The concierge can't really answer that. This area of science has been studied a lot. And it turns out that it's really difficult to do science arbitration well. Sheila Jaffe-Snoff wrote a book about science advisors. She concluded the notion that science advisors can or do limit themselves to addressing purely scientific issues in particular seems fundamentally misconceived. The advisory process seems increasingly important as a locus for negotiating scientific differences that have political weight. Just to illustrate this quickly, this is an assignment I give my students in my science technology policy class, and we did a bit of this in my course this semester on climate change. Your assignment is to put together an advisory committee on the Preble's jumping mouse. How would you put that committee together? There's 12 experts out there. Let's say you need a committee of 6. All of those experts have voiced their political views on EPA regulation out there. How do you determine who should be on that advisory committee? Do you consider the political factors? Do you ignore the political factors? Do you come up with some criteria for what the best science is? It becomes really difficult to do that well, particularly for contested topics for which scientists, like everybody else, have opinions on. There are many examples, many examples, where the linear model creeps in here and we say, this is the Plan B medication or Vioxx, that let's just get the facts right and then we can make decisions. It's complicated. The Bush administration and then later the Obama administration said this idea of Plan B, when should it be available to young women over the counter? Is it 16 years old or 17 years old? During the Bush administration, they wanted it to be 18 years old, I believe. The advocates for Plan B said they wanted it to be available to young women at 16 years old. In all cases, they said the science should dictate this. The Obama administration took it off the table by saying, all right, it's going to be 17. Did science make that decision? I would say probably not. It was probably a political decision. And because it was obviously wrapped up in abortion politics. What about medical marijuana? Is medical marijuana, is that a decision that's made on science? What about a drinking age? Is 21 years, science says 21, that's where it's safe, and that 20 years and 364 days, no, it's bad for you. I would say, I mean, these are perfect examples of politically negotiated outcomes that have scientific input, but they're not made on science. Here's another example. Vioxx and Bextra are painkillers for which it turns out they had some really nasty side effects for a certain part of the population. And the FDA has drug approval panels which vote on whether certain drugs should be made available for use in our medical system. And an enterprising NGO went in and looked at the votes and identified which members of the panel had taken pharmaceutical company money in the past 3 years. So it was a close vote. Bextra, they said, the panel said 17 to 13, let's keep it on the market. Now, if you break down that vote according to who took money, and I think the threshold was like $3,000 over the past 5 years. The members with company ties voted 9-1 in favor of keeping it on the market, and the others 12-8 against. Now you can, I'm creative, I can spin this a lot of ways. One way is that the people in industry obviously were much smarter. Why? Because they worked with the drugs, they did the field trials and so on. Now the other way I'll spin it, you know, they're corporate shills. They've taken their $3,000 at least, and they want to stay on the gravy train. But I can very quickly, like this NGO did, reduce this from a science decision to a decision that I can determine what the outcome is based on who has corporate ties. And then we could have a nice blogospheric debate over corporate ties and the ethics and morals of these people, and the science is all gone. It was the same with Vioxx, 23-9 and 9-1 and 14-8. And this is a perfect example of how we replace considerations of science with political considerations. So I would say there was some flaw in how they put together these committees. if it worked out in this fashion. All right, let me zip through this last few slides. Now, I found it quite interesting that the National Research Council, which gave guidance on how to put together a science advisory panel, said it's inappropriate to ask prospective science panelists to provide non-relevant information, such as voting record, political party affiliation, or position on particular policies, which would seem to make sense at first cut. But when you take a look at the composition of this committee, it had 10 people on it. 5 of them had served Republican presidents as political appointees and 5 Democrats. They were really fortunate to have such a close partisan alignment because no one would question that their committee was stacked. I would say that this committee was put together by design for exactly that reason, to avoid saying they had a stacked committee. And of course, you don't have to ask. When John Kerry was going against George Bush, 47 Nobel laureates in medicine signed a petition supporting John Kerry. I could put together a wonderful science advisory panel, picking from those 47. You would never question their credentials. They had Nobel Prizes, for goodness sake. And I would know what their positions would be. So it's complicated. All right, the issue advocate. The issue advocate, the defining feature of the issue advocate is they try to reduce the scope of choice that you have to a particular direction. This is honorable, fundamental to democracy. If you drive around Boulder right now, you'll start seeing signs up in people's yards telling you what to do. So it's like going to this restaurant in Boulder. I'll just give you a map to where the McDonald's are. Who knows? Maybe I have shares in McDonald's, or one of my kids works there, or I just really like their burgers. But I'm not misrepresenting knowledge. I'm giving you factually accurate knowledge. I'm just limiting the knowledge I'm giving you because I want you to make a choice in a particular way. This is the characteristics of issue advocacy. It's been around for a long time. This is Philip Handler, the president of the National Academy of Sciences in 1976. We've learned the scientist advocate on either side of a politicized debate is likely to be more advocate than scientists, and this has unfavorably altered the public view of both the nature of the scientific endeavor and the personal attributes of scientists. Contrast that with what I call the honest broker of policy alternatives. I could give you this travel guide to Boulder. It has all the restaurants in Boulder listed with little stars as to how much it costs, a little bit about their menu, with the idea that if I give you this, you'll be able to make an informed decision about where you want to eat. And obviously, let's say this is the Lonely Planet guide. It'll have its spin. It'll include some things, exclude others. But what I want to make clear is there's a qualitative difference between giving someone this map of McDonald's and a travel guide. So here, I'm trying to compel you to make a particular decision. Here, I'm trying to empower you to make a decision according to your own values. Now, there's trade-offs here. Let's say I really, really, really want you to go to McDonald's. If I give you this travel guide, you may not choose McDonald's. I'll be sacrificing, and I'm the expert, right? So if I give you this guide, I'll be stepping back and saying, I trust you to make your own decision. If you really want that Preble's jumping mouse to be regulated under the Endangered Species Act, if you say, well, here's your choices, then you're stepping away from that authority you might command as an expert. This view is out there as well. So this is Lord May, who's at Oxford. He says, the role of the scientist is not to determine which risks are worth taking or deciding what choices we should take. The scientist must be involved in indicating what the possible choices, constraints, and possibilities are. The role of the scientist is not to decide between the possibilities, but to determine what the possibilities are. This is a perspective that I rarely see, particularly in the environmental area. But the scientific enterprise has gotten so politicized that there are no shortage of scientists out there who are willing to go out and tell you exactly what you ought to do. You should be going to McDonald's. Very few scientists these days, or scientific organizations, who will say, here's the equivalent of a travel guide, good luck. We all have great experience with honest brokers. If you ever use a travel website, here's a few, then you know what an honest broker is. It doesn't tell you where to go. It doesn't tell you how much to pay. What it says is, you tell me what you want to do, and I'll tell you what your options are. And these are very valuable functions if you know what it is you want to do, and all you want to know are what are my choices. And so what I think the policy world needs is the equivalent of these sort of functions to help policymakers know what their choices are. So this is that map, then hopefully it makes a little bit more sense now that I've illustrated it with the examples. What I see, and I'll end, is a lot of claims by the scientific community that no, we're just pure scientists, we're just science arbiters, but they're really acting as issue advocates. They're hiding behind science. It's what I call stealth issue advocacy. This is what smuggles politics into science. And almost no one is willing to step back from the authority that science has to empower people to make decisions. Why? Because they could make decisions in a way that the experts don't like. In the book, I have some criteria for how you know what context makes sense. That's well beyond what I can go into today. But this is where I started. So experts have choices, and how you make those choices are important. There's a tendency to always be pointing towards advocacy, giving people maps where McDonald's are. And it would be nice if we paid more attention to honest brokering. So here's how you can find me. There's a lot of papers and analysis related to this. I don't have my blog up there. I have a blog, rogerpielkejr.blogspot.com, where I talk about these and various topics. And I will say, it doesn't always make scientists particularly comfortable to raise these topics, particularly in this politicized atmosphere where it's viewed you're either on one side or the other. So thanks for letting me go over a little bit, and I'd welcome having a conversation if anybody wants to chat. Thanks.
Well, the most obvious one would be how practical is it that scientists can be honest brokers? For example, everybody has jobs, everybody has things to do. So that's the kind of the point of experts, right? That you want to listen to the experts and have some sort of trust in them so that you don't have to do the research. And also, again, it's impractical that if I'm like, I think the analogy is slightly flawed because it's easy for me to know where to go, so I can go to Carlos. But then to make a decision about a policy, if you give me a big binder of all the science, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I see exactly what you're saying.
That, I think
Yeah.
that's the reason why issue advocacy has emerged, because people are, it's not practical that you get an informed decision, you can make an informed decision all the time.
Yeah, well, there's a few things there. One, and I think it's a great question. One is that the honest broker doesn't give the policymaker science. The honest broker gives them options, right? So there's a big difference between saying, here's a binder with all the relevant science, to saying, all right, here's your decision options in this context. The second thing is, and I make a big deal about this in the book, is really none of us are very well suited to be honest brokers as individuals in particular contexts for reasons that you described. We all have our views, our biases, somebody pays our salary. The best place to look for honest brokers are leading authoritative institutions of science governance, like the National Research Council, like the Royal Society in the UK, like the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which there are a number of wonderful examples of where these organizations come together and they say, here's your options. I'll give you an example. It's the deorbiting of the TRIM satellite, Tropical Rainfall Measurement Mission. And NASA faces a decision on whether to let the fuel run out and continue to gather observations, or to use some of that fuel to deorbit it in the ocean and guarantee it doesn't land on somebody's house. I participated in an assessment of the options there. And basically what we did is we said, all right, here's your choices. We're not going to say which ones you should take. We put together a committee of people inside NASA, outside NASA, people whose expertise was in risk assessment, social scientists, and so on. People who were talking about the politics, what if it lands on the North Korean embassy or something like that. And the idea there was we'll give options, and it is the case in a lot of these circumstances that decision makers don't want options. Why? Because then they have to be on the hook for making a choice. They would much rather say, these wonderful experts told us to burn up all the fuel, because that gives them a layer of plausible deniability. That's a risk for the scientific community. And the scientific community should be pushed. I mean, there are these incentives that work against honest brokering, right? Decision makers don't want them because it makes them accountable. Scientists don't want honest brokers because it limits their chance to exert their authority on the process. In my book, one of the examples I use is this decision to go to war in Iraq, in which a lot of that centered on intelligence and the existence of weapons of mass destruction. I argue that that debate was short-circuited because there weren't new options being introduced to the discussion, maybe diplomatic negotiations and so on. It was go to war or not, what does the intelligence say? So I think there are some cases where you can make a very strong case, climate change is one of them, where the scope of options on the table for choice, they're all bad options. And if you need to really expand that scope of options, that's where the interest group pluralism breaks down. James Madison's view was that, well, all the options will turn up through this give and take of the democratic process. And I think in many cases, that's fine, that interest group pluralism serves that function. But particularly where there's topics where you need expert input, the grassroots are not going to come up with those options. And you want to have an honest brokering process. And so you don't always want it, but you do want it sometimes, and we give up that opportunity. I'll give you an example real quick. When I interviewed Frank Press, he said one of the great failures, so after he was science advisor to Jimmy Carter, who became the president of the National Academy of Sciences, and he said the National Academy of Sciences, NRC, never did a report on nuclear winter. This was in the early 1980s. And I asked him, so why didn't you do a report on nuclear winter and its effects? He said, because something like 70% of the members of the National Academy of Sciences signed an advocacy statement on the topic saying, I don't know what it was, this, that, or the other thing. But he said that destroyed our credibility on the issue. Anything they would say scientifically would be viewed through this political lens. If that history has gone by, but at the time it was an important topic. And if it would be important to have the advice of those scientists, then they gave that up because they took an advocacy position. So it's not always for everyone at all the time, but it's a function that I think we ought to protect in the scientific establishment.
Some of these issues are so big and overreaching, they're not particularly related to things like climate change or how you should treat a particular set of satellites, what have you. These are big issues like how much you can fund National Science Foundation or the National Institutes of Health. As you know, a few years ago, decisions were made to increase the funding of the National Institutes of Health at a certain rate that made them, I think, very much larger than the National Science Foundation, just in their increase at some point. So, of course, if you ask somebody in science, they're going to say, well, should you increase the National Institute of Health, assuming the physical sciences. And similarly, if you ask somebody in more biological areas, of course we should increase the National Institute of Health. These are issues so broad, it's very difficult to get quote-unquote experts. What does an expert mean when you start talking about increasing the National Institute of Health by a factor of 2 when it's already large?
Well, these are essentially political decisions, right? It's up to a few years ago, the NASA, NSF, Department of Energy Science were in an appropriations subcommittee with veterans and housing. And so $1 added to science funding is $1 you take away from homeless people and vets. There's no formula for that. As we have moved more towards science that is justified based on its expected return to society, there actually are people who have expertise in, if you fund a portfolio of medical research, what are the expected societal benefits from that to be? Now, I don't think decisions are often made based in that way, but I mean, the reality is that NIH, medical research, the entire NIH is about $35 billion. NSF is about $5 billion, about 7 to 1. Is that the right ratio? Well, if you believe in Madison's view of democracy, the answer is yes, of course it is, because that's what the political process decided the ratio was. If you think, well, actually, if we funded more NSF, we'd get advances in energy and material science and so on, that give us greater economic benefits than the medical research, then you might have an objective case to make for that. And you can take your sign and walk around the halls of Congress and make your case. But that's an example. I think the science funding is entirely a political process. And it's actually not like satellite reentries or even climate change, where you can actually offer a set of options. It's inside the sausage factory stuff, yeah.
Last question.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that concerns me is that in our society, our politics seem to be increasingly polarized. And a lot of policymakers already know what the answers they want are. So rather than seeking out honest brokers, they seek out people who support their positions. And if you're a scientist, that kind of forces you, at least from my point of view,
Yeah.
to an advocacy
Yeah.
position. And I personally want to know how to confront that. How do I retain credibility and still sway the interests of our politicians and policymakers with what I feel might be the correct decision?
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is to give up that trying to balance those two things. You have a choice to make. And one of the things that I have argued in my work is that the integrity of science is an issue in and of itself that is important. Climate change is important, health is important, endangered species are important, but I guess I don't see any of these topics as so important that we want to sacrifice the institutions of science for them, and that we can make good decisions and protect the institutions of science. On the partisanship point, let me just say, I'm trained as a political scientist, and I'm aware of these statements that, yeah, things are more polarized now. And in the short term, they probably are. But we have to recognize that all of our views, whether we know it or not, are colored by the fact that the US House of Representatives was held by Democrats from 1957 through 1994. And this idea that we have Republican control of the House of Representatives back and forth a little bit in that time period is new. It's fundamentally new. We had a remarkable era of, I would say, partisan stability in this country. And you can go back further in time, look at the civil rights, look at the progressive movement. My goodness, go back to Reconstruction and the Civil War. People had guns on the floor of the Congress. I'm not so sure that things are more partisan than they've ever been. And the fact that people cherry pick science to support their predetermined views, I mean, I think they're probably doing that in ancient Greece. So I don't see that as anything new. And particularly with the blogosphere now and the internet and social media, it's very easy to get more worked up about these issues than maybe it was possible in the past because we have more access to information. I guess my plea is that someone out there should be paying attention to the health of our institutions of science at the same time we're engaged in these political battles. And my worry is that we're too ready to sacrifice the authority of science for short-term political gains. And as we've seen from the elections in 2004 and 2008, there's very little payoff to the scientific community for doing so. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much.